Here we are broadcasting. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me once again for the Sunday special live at a bit different time because, again, this guest is currently residing in Australia, so we have to be kind to their time frame as compared to that in America. But since there's so many people internationally that usually check in, I'm sure it's going to be all different times for everybody. Right now, it's still not quite daylight here in the American Midwest. As many of you know, this time our guest is returning. This would be at least the third time here, and in the past, he's graced us with presentations, not only on the way that Anatoly Fomenko designed and implemented his maxima correlation principle, but also his chronological mapping, and then, of course, his astronomical work, things like the parameter D problem. He has for quite some time, besides being a programmer, been working on Latin translations to Scaliger's work, and you can still find the readings he's doing as he is getting this translating done on his YouTube channel under his name. So I just want to thank and welcome once again Chip Wilman. How you doing, Chip?
Doing good, John. Thanks for having me back on.
No, thank you for coming. Every time you're here, it provides us with, I think, a little bit more light and some down-to-earth, let's just say, translations of Fomenko's work, because, you know, I'm not the dullest tool in the shed, but I myself have found a number of facets of his work sometimes a little bit difficult to grasp. And I would imagine, based on a lot of comments I've gotten on the 30-some readings that I've done just on Chronology 1, that there's a lot of people out there that also, they feel the same way. A lot of the disciplines that he's proficient in, most people don't ever touch in their lives. Even educated people don't. So we always appreciate you coming on and talking with us about this and helping to clarify it. Now, when we spoke before about scheduling you again on these Sunday special broadcasts I'm doing, you said that recently you had done some traveling and that you would have some things to present to us. What was that?
Oh, well, I recently took a trip to Tuscany in Italy for an Etruscan megalithic expedition from the New Earth Channel with OBRY Projekt. And so we went there for 2 weeks and we stayed around a few different places and saw a lot of the rock-cut ruins and other megalithic architecture that's there dating from 1000 BC, according to the mainstream history.
Now, you showed me a couple of slides when we got together on Thursday. Do you want to bring up that slideshow and tell us about all of the photos you were able to take while you were there?
I can go through that if you'd like.
That'd be great.
All right, I'll start that up. All right, so it should be on the screen now.
Yes.
And so basically what's in this slide deck is basically in background information on the expedition and a few of the details into it. And then a lot of the trip was focused around looking at rock-cut ruins. And so there's a lot of necropoli and rock-cut ruins pictures in there. And then the rest of them are a lot shorter, don't have that many pictures in it, but it's living Tufu cities, collapsing rooms, polygonal masonry, cart ruts, quarries and mines, via cavas, building ruins, tourist parks, and finally the special thing that was only found a couple years ago is the pyramid in Tuscany. So I guess the first thing is why actually go on these expeditions, and one of the things that I found on YouTube was the New Earth channel with Sylvia Ivanova, and she's the one who introduced me to the flamenco conspiracies or flamenco's theories that he has. She initially talks about the Survivor series, which is supposedly people from Atlantis coming back and teaching the old ways to the nomads and the Aboriginal people who survived the last great cataclysm. But then she brings this video in where flamenco actually makes the history much shorter as far as our known history, and everything before that did happen, but nobody knows anything about it because they've destroyed all the records. So one of the things that I've wanted to do is actually go to the places that have been recently been found and changed mainstream history in some way. And then to also see the evidence used by alternative researchers and hopefully identify other viewpoints, such as you have to use power tools in order to make that cut. That's one of the favorite ones. So why is it actually an expedition? It's, well, these are sites that aren't frequented by the average tourist very much. And there's a good chance that we won't find the site after walking lots of kilometers. So there's definitely, to get to each of these sites, in some of them we've walked tens of kilometers to get there. In Italy, it was a lot better. It's only about a kilometer. So Sylvia Ivanova was the expedition leader. And like I said, she was the creator of the YouTube Survivor series. She brings to light hypotheses and evidence that don't fit our mainstream history. She has a lot of interesting theories on things. And for the most part, the proof that she finds backs up those theories that she has. You may not agree with those theories, but the evidence that she displays is rather interesting.
I agree.
So her information's there on the screen. So a previous expedition that I did with Sylvie was in Bulgaria, where we looked at Thracian tombs, megalithic fortresses, rock-cut ruins on the Black Sea, and ancient temples. And so these are just some of the pictures that were from the first expedition.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, I've been very interested in going on these megalithic expeditions. And the first one I took was to Malta, where you can see the 4000 BC temples that they actually had constructed. Some of them were 5600 BC. And these were the earliest known construction efforts that had been detected before Göbekli Tepe was accepted by the mainstream. Another one is I have a friend that I play music with. He's currently living in Oman. And I went on a trip with him to see a lot of the ruins that were in Oman. And finally, we went to Portugal last year, and I took off on a megalithic expedition by myself and saw a lot of the actual megaliths that they have in Portugal, which apparently has the third highest concentration, number one being England and number two being France. So if I get on with what we actually saw in the Etruscan ruins, we started off at Poggio di Maramema, which interestingly enough was all the address that was given. We basically told arrive at this place, and it just said Poggio di Maramema, and you type it into Google and it actually found it. So there's only one place in Italy called that. And from there we went around to several of the actual hills around there in the mountains, and they had, all of them had rock cut ruins. We went over to Sorrento in the Pitigliano area, and again for about 5 days. I think we stayed the longest in this place, but probably 6 days. And we went around to all of the different rock cut ruins there and some of the actual tourist parks. And finally in Viterbo we did the same thing and saw lots of rock cut ruins.
And when you say rock cut, we're talking about people cut into the rock to make homes, streets, possibly root cellars, everything that you would probably need for a basic day-to-day civilized society, right?
Yes, that's what they were doing. It's the entire place is basically found on volcanic pumice that was ejected 30 million years ago and several times, and it's built up a huge layer, tens of meters thick, 30, 40 feet thick, and rivers have run through that in the 30 million years and cut very deep valleys and to the streams at all of the bottom.
Yeah, you were telling me that it's very easy rock to cut through. And there are even records of Roman soldiers, one individual soldier being able to cut how much as far as cubic feet or cubic yards of this
About
in a
1 cubic
day?
yard.
One
The current
cubic yard in a
translation
day
that I've seen was about 1 cubic meter of rock
with hand tools,
with basically using a pick.
using a pick, just picking right through it. And that's pretty soft rock.
And this stuff does crumble pretty easily when you impact it with another harder stone. And so they could have even just been carving this with stones.
Pretty low on the Mohs scale then, pumice, this kind of rock.
The toughness is very weak.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, one thing I had asked you when we were looking at the pictures was you had mentioned how easy it is, not only how soft it is, but just as you mentioned, rivers have cut through it. So it would be hard to imagine, would it not, that it would be these ruins would be still in as good a shape as they are, were they as old as it is assumed, correct?
Well, there's a lot of signs of erosion that's happened on the cliffs that they've been built into.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does look like it's eroding a lot faster than you'd expect to see any ruins, any remains left.
And the assumption is that these were built in what year? The mainstream assumption.
Mainstream assumption is around 1200 to 600 BC.
Oh, yeah. That's a long time. Okay. And you would just expect by the rate of erosion that there would be a lot more eroded away by now if that were the case, correct?
It would either be a lot more eroded away or they built rooms all the way through the mountains. And so as it keeps on eroding away, new rooms are just being exposed.
Ah, I see. Okay. Now, is there evidence that the second being that there was maybe so much erosion that new rooms are actually exposed now? Is there evidence of that possibility that exists on site? Or is there more evidence of the first possibility, which is that they're just not as old as we've been told?
Our Italian guide, who grew up in the area, insists that new rooms are discovered every couple of years.
Okay.
Whole rows of new rooms as the mountain collapses.
Uh-huh. Now, I guess maybe it would be difficult to establish a great deal of evidence of large scale erosion, right? Because a lot of that would probably erode very, the way it would erode would not be in large rocks that would just build up in a pile somewhere, right? It would erode in small amounts, in sort of a colloidal way. It would just wash away little by little, but at a fast rate, right? I mean, like in the same way as if you built a sandcastle, it will erode very fast, but by the time that it erodes, there won't probably be necessarily any evidence that you had erosion taking place. Like in some places, you can see evidence of demolition being done because you'll have rubble. Um, uh, but in this case, you probably wouldn't have any rubble left over to show how much erosion has taken place. Is that not true?
Well, I do have some great pictures on a lot of those collapsing rooms later on in the slide deck here.
Okay.
And that actually then shows at least, trees that have fallen over and that are no longer vertical.
Yes.
Other trees from further ago that have actually straightened their trunks up after a collapse,
Okay.
and just rooms being eroded away.
Okay. Then please proceed. Sorry.
Okay, I'll continue on. It's no problem. I've got these little section breaks at the end of each of the sections so we can talk about it and not miss anything.
Gotcha.
All right. So like I said, the most ruins that we saw were these rock-cut necropoli. And so they're usually down between these mountains. These mountains here were all just carved away, and so this whole entranceway has been removed, and then they cut a smaller room into it. You've got benches on the inside, and so apparently the deceased person would lie in the middle. The rest would sit around him for a couple hours and mourn. So they're all over the place. So you'll see these signs. There's hundreds of these individual caves, and that they've actually explored and documented and put up the signs for the tourist. They're not really in open places where anybody's making money off of it. They're just at the side of the road, and they've noted the archaeological significance of it. So inside the caves, these are all cut out of the humus rock or the tufu rock that's in there. The bottom parts are supposedly where other people were buried in these little holes. These ones were actually pretty small, but in the back you have another room where other people would have been laid to rest. Many of them have several chambers, and they have rooms that go through. And this area out here was actually collapsed, and so that would have actually been covered at one time, and these would be a further part of the catacomb. This is looking with my little blue light, which was solar powered. Never doing that again. Getting a real flashlight. More of the actual small rock cut ruins as they go in, and our Italian guide in the back coming towards us. In more stuff cut. As it's a video, people can always go back and look at the video, the pictures, so I'll go a little bit quicker. More of the rock cut ruins, and this one was actually collapsed, and there was rubble around. Other rooms that look like they used to be a lot bigger at one time, but then fallen apart. And then, like I said, this goes all the way through to those sections. These little holes, we were told, is to hold the ashes. So it's if you were not as rich to get your body actually your own cave, you'd actually be cremated and be placed in one of these for a lot smaller fee. And interesting, below this, the floor is collapsed, and there's another room underneath that is filled up with dirt and rubble. And again, above it, there's another level with other rooms that go on. It's the name of the park. I was saying, more of the signs all over the place. They're just dotted on all the hills. These are apparently the original cover stones that were covering whoever was buried there. More rock removed and cut out. A rock staircase that we all decided to go up. This one's a little bit more preserved park, but they're just incorporated the rock cut ruins into it. Now we start looking at some of the more advanced ones. I believe these ones are newer. The ceilings were starting to be cut differently. This one actually had what looked like a metal pillar there, or I mean a stone pillar, but it's actually just carved out of the rock. Further ones actually had a slanted ceiling, and again, what looks to be a rock pillar at the top. And another one. This one was a rather interesting view on the top of one of the caves. It was carved out. In some of the older ones, apparently these are the oldest tombs, they had this T shape that was around it. And we've seen that at several of the actual older sites that we went to. There's actually one just off the side of a road. This entire section along here is more of those rock cut ruins, an aqueduct or the bridge that goes across in one of the tofu cities. This entire hill is just covered with catacombs and caves that go through. In modern times, they wall them up if the hole's too big. More of the actual funerary chambers for ashes. The rooms cut down and then filled in with dirt, so you can't even get down there anymore. Reused for livestock and interesting niches all around. More of the actual rock cut ruins in the lower level with the water that's actually filled in. Rock cut stairs going up to the top of a mountain where there's more of these rock cut ruins. At the top of the hillock, an entire top of the mountain was carved out to be an amphitheater or something. This is actually a rock cut house that was towards the end of one day. And above it was this wall where it looks like there was this used to be a complete room and things have just fallen away. And this tombstone here is basically how you find the pyramid that we'll see at the end. And it's the tombstone of a horse that died there. And that house is just around the corner. The rooms that we got to later just kept getting bigger and bigger. They would actually brick up the sides, and the vehicle likely used to park in this garage. They'd hollowed it out so it wasn't a natural feature, or if it was, they've extended it greatly by just chipping away at the rock. This looks like it used to have a wall in between that's collapsed. It was carved away. A little trough at the bottom, maybe for water. More stuff cut in. A fireplace or bath or something. More of the actual feed trays. This is likely, we decided, for animals, where you'd actually put your fodder in there. This is part of where we think shops might have been. This goes all the way through, and there's appear to be entrances over to the right-hand side. They look like this, and it goes all the way through, and so it's a rather large room. They call this a necropolis. It looks like you'd actually have people working and living around there. From the other side, little places to store things inside these shops and possibly workshops. This is the inside of one of them that has a collapse in the back and rooms that go off on each of the sides. This is at the top of a hill where you'll see some of the temples that we see. This is out on the cliff, and things seem to be eroding away where they had lots of these subterranean caverns. Another cavern. More rooms just cut into the rocks. On the other side, decoration for the tourists. Me inside one of the rooms. Apparently for funerary ashes. Interesting, this is actually their Colosseum on the back side. Places cut, and these rooms look like it used to be a lot deeper, and a lot of erosion has come in and filled it up, because these doors do look rather huge, and once you walk inside, the ceiling is still very high. In fact, you can see the top of the ceiling in here for that entire room. And this is another very large area that they had in there. Rock cut rooms, again. Paths that seem to have been filled up, and they used to be a lot deeper. The actual sides of it crumbling away. And here's the actual Colosseum. It was cut directly into the rock. A view from the top. The other side. Tunnels that were actually cut inside. Unfortunately, it wasn't open the day that we showed up there, so we just got the tour around the outside. So looking back, if behind me would have been where the Colosseum was, we have a beautiful church that's there, and behind the church, apparently, Charlemagne's residence. But you can see everywhere that these rock cuts are used by the current residents as sheds. They're holding up the walls and they're locking them so that their valuables inside. These are actually in a park, and this is probably where they keep their equipment for maintaining the park. This is out in the field, and a farmer's utilizing one of these sheds to store farming equipment. But this one is one of the largest that I've been in. From the back, that actually could easily hold 4 buses. Our tour guide mentioned in Vitrebo that the bus terminal was cut into a rock, and it could hold 6 buses easily and have them turn around inside and park. And outside of that is the view that you see from that very large cavern. And last in this section is how they're reusing some of this stuff in the rural areas as a farm. They keep chickens in here, lamb and sheep. All of these are filled with animals. And so that's the first part with just the rock cut ruins, which was a majority of what we were actually looking at when we were there.
Those stairs looked in really good shape for being over 3,000 years old. I would have expected them to actually be far more rounded than they were. All of the risers and treads seem to be in very good shape without, a serious amount, because what you would expect is a lot of rounding right off that front edge, at least.
Now the
And
stairs
those
were
looked
actually
great.
cut into a different type of rock that was much harder.
Ah, okay.
So
Well,
a
then
lot of
that
the
makes sense.
rooms are cut into the pumice of a volcano, but that actually appears to be a hard igneous or metamorphic rock.
Then that makes sense. Now, those burial chambers that had all of the squares, or sometimes looked like somewhat arched squares cut into the walls, and you said that they would keep ashes in there. Is So what did they say that that's what they found was ashes in those?
Nothing was found inside of them,
Oh, okay.
but they make the speculation on one of the signs
Hmm.
that it was used to hold the funerary ashes of many of the commoners.
About how large were those, would you say, in feet square?
8 to 10 inches wide.
Oh, those were pretty small.
Yeah, they're
I
all pretty
see, yeah.
small. They're only about like that.
So they could potentially have held ossuaries. Um, Instead of just ashes, it's possible that ossuaries could have been put in there
Definitely.
instead of
Could have.
remains loose.
After
Okay,
1,000 years, though, I'm pretty sure everybody's removed those and sold them somewhere else.
sure. Yeah, all right. Um, yeah, I just mentioned that because I've seen other, well, similar rooms, and sometimes it's speculated that what was kept in those spaces was ossuaries. Um, but everybody has different methods of burial. And when you get a body down to just bare bones, even if you don't burn it, the bones can even fit in a very tight space. And I've seen of and heard of, bones being fit into very small uh, spaces for burial too. So that's why I was wondering if anybody had actually found, ashes that are like remains or not. Um, but that's about all I thought of on that. If you want to start the next part of your presentation, I got
All
my
right.
son up. I'll get him distracted.
All right, I'll start it up. All right, so the next part of it was the actual modern cities that they have in Tuscany. And they're all appearing to be built upon the same sort of rock cut ruins. It's just on a living city, so they're not ruins. And you can see where erosion is taken away from the hill, and you'll see lots of actual caves that pop out from those hills. Inside the actual city, you can see this part is where the masonry starts. Below that is actually solid rock, and they've got rooms in the cities right into the solid rock. Along the actual back of it, you've got a raised platform, which explains why you'd have entrances halfway up a cliff. If they had a way to get there, it'd be easy to do it. Inside the cities, there's staircases cut directly through the rock that lead up. There's more caves cut into the actual rock walls, which they're using as garages along here. And again, a lot of the time, the rock just melts together, and that, I believe, is still rooms down there. And down here, you still have more rock cut garages that are leading all the way. More examples of the actual rock leading directly into masonry built on top, where rooms are cut into the rock. Along the avenue, you have all of these rock cut rooms that are being used as garages, both ways. This was an actual point of sale in Pitibiliano. Unfortunately, cut directly into the rock, and a bus came up and stayed there until we had to leave. This is basically just a garage into somebody's house, which has an outer plaster casing on, but inside it is actually still just a rock cut room. And so they've put plaster on the outside to make it look like a modern home. This is the remain of an ancient pillar that you'd see in a lot of the Etruscan ruins. And again, more just rock cut rooms that they have directly in the walls everywhere. This is the back of somebody's house. Here we have rock cut ruins that look a lot more weathered. One of their castles, which is built directly onto the rock cut ruins. On the other side, you can go down, and some very weathered stone steps. And finally, there's even a pizza shop that we went to that's cut directly into the rock cut ruins. This is the main dining area, and you're well below ground at that point. And here you can actually see from the actual cellar down here going up to the dining room. And apparently this is reed, then plaster that they're using to hold the top of the ceiling up.
That was very good. That's interesting. When you were scrolling through those, especially those areas that possibly would have been more marketplace, there are actually a few civilizations mentioned in the Old Testament that lived in rocks. They're literally described as dwelling in rocks. And since everything that I've read and experienced in the Old Testament tells me that these civilizations were anything but primitive, I would imagine that in its heyday, this would have been a really beautiful place to live, actually.
I'd have to agree with that, especially because they did put plaster over all of their walls to make them nice and white so they could paint on them. Apparently,
right.
It was very painted, and they had their own language, and it was written everywhere. I think Herodotus referred to them as the troglodytes.
as troglodytes, so just meaning cave dwellers, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Now that's interesting because I, as a carpenter, I've worked on homes that were just made out of concrete slabs and covered with earth and given pretty much mostly southern exposure. Now, did a lot of these, I forget you telling me what direction, were they facing the south so they had plenty of southern exposure during the winter months?
All the rock cut ruins on the south of the mountains had nice southern exposure. They did go all the way around the mountain, though. So there were northern caves also.
Okay.
They didn't seem to discriminate.
Yeah. I would think they would probably just have other means they used. Well, we are talking about the Mediterranean too. How cold does it usually get in that area during the winter months? Do you know?
It snowed twice in the past 100 years.
It snowed twice in the past 100 years. Kind of like Jerusalem. That's about as much snowfall as, well, Palestine usually gets. It's extremely sparse, especially in middle Palestine. So that would be a pretty warm area in general. They probably wouldn't have to worry too much about heat too often, I would assume.
It's rather warm. We did have a couple days where it was chilly, but I did not have a heavy winter jacket with me when we went on the tour.
Yeah, so I did notice that those stairs in the restaurant or leading up to it, those were out of the same kind of pumice rock, correct? So they did look a lot more worn.
Yes.
Yeah.
And those were probably recut less than 20 years ago.
You know, it's amazing how much the combination of sun and rain, and then if you live in temperate climates, snow and ice, how fast those can do damage to or erode a lot of materials. Now, if it's good stone or rock, it would appear to take many, many long centuries to begin to erode those things. But geez, snow and rain, if it's a relatively soft material like what you're describing, they can really go to work on eroding that stuff. It's probably really good that that isn't in an area that's even more temperate, or I would have to imagine there would be far more erosion to it. It's like in the and it's actually in Colorado. I want to say the south, and you being native would probably know about this. In the southwestern portion of the state is it Mesa Grande? All of those stone cut dwellings, this huge, huge, huge amount of stone cut dwellings in
Mesa Verde.
southwest Colorado. Mesa Verde. That's what it is. Mesa Verde. Into stone, much harder to cut actually than what we're looking at here. Now, I know that Sylvie was leading the tour, but what are some of the impressions that she gave you? Let's just say on what you've shown us so far. What are her theories concerning age, who did this, when, or anything else you might tell us?
Her theories were discussed quite a bit on the actual trip, and I do believe she's still working on her latest theories and validating previous theories and accepting new theories.
Yeah.
A lot of what we saw initially, I believe she thought would be too difficult for people to be cutting out. But it is actually a very soft rock, and I was able to, with just a hard rock that was kind of pointed, split them very easily and just break off large chunks.
Yeah, this seems to be one of those examples that, unlike with a lot of other sites that have either large stones that had to have been cut, or sites like Mesa Verde that are cut into rock, which, you know, of course the theories about, you know, Stone Age tools, Iron Age tools, they don't cut it because in many instances the tools they say that they had at those times don't even register as high on the Mohs scale as the rock that they're saying to have cut in. However, this site seems to be one of those exceptions where it's much softer, much easier to cut into, but as you said, it has a fast erosion rate. And I would assume that that part of Italy does get plenty of rain. I mean, everything looked lush enough around there. I would think they get plenty of rain and sun there, so probably some pretty decent erosion going on year after year.
There's definitely a lot of erosion that occurs. I would agree with
Right.
that.
Yeah. So you had another section to this then?
Oh yeah, there's a couple more.
Okay.
Lot fewer pictures from now on.
Okay. Yeah, please proceed.
All right. So now we can continue on with the collapsing rooms. And so this would have been the north side of a mountain where you can actually see that ceilings just collapsed down, and now you have almost a 45-degree angle ground walking up to the next level. There's actually a level terrace here, and then I'm standing on one, and these have collapsed down, allowing you to access the upper levels. Otherwise, the long path goes all the way around and comes back. Here's a look, and this was actually a collapsed roof that was just fallen down. Here are plenty of the trees that I was talking about. This section here has fallen down in the recent time, where these trees have been knocked over. This tree over here looks like this part collapsed a lot longer ago, and from this point started changing its degree that it was growing. And a lot of the trees over here, you can see that they're bent over. This one is actually, I'm holding the camera level, and this entire side had just collapsed over. Again, walking along one of the paths, you can see where things have been collapsing in recent times with the angles of the tree pointing not directly up. More parts, which looks like it was a collapsed roof at one time, and walls would have been, or structures to support those walls would have been underneath the parts that actually still survive. The archaeologists have put in several structures in these caves in order to protect them, to keep them from collapsing even further. This wouldn't have happened too long ago, as this is a picture of a saint, I believe in the 16th century, they said. And that when this was put up, I imagine it would have been straight up and down, not fallen over. This is actually a wall that's inside of there. We were trying to decide if it was actually real tufa or if it was somehow placed in there, and it looks like it's the original rock, but it's got very sharp edges compared to everything else around it. Again, these are the back of rooms, and the entire top has fallen off. This would have been a wall, and the cave probably came out another 20 feet. A room that's all that's left inside of here as the rest of it's collapsed. More rooms. I mean, you've got sharp edges leading up to here with no floor below it. So it's very likely that there was something there at some time and it's fallen.
Yeah, you know what? And I don't know if you we can just wait until you're through with the other portions, but we did speak a little bit on dendrochronology, and I noticed that you had mentioned what tree growth there was in these areas. So whether you want to talk about it a little or not, which could get us definitely rabbit trailed pretty hard into that direction. Was there anything concerning the tree growth and the collapsing that you put together as far as, the age of that? Was there much that you noticed about that tree growth that made you think perhaps the dates of these things was off or not?
Well, it definitely looked like in the last 50 years, there had been sections that had collapsed and the trees had then righted themselves. And those trees couldn't have been much more than, 75 years old, as far as the thickness of them, and
Yeah.
likely much younger. I didn't actually cut into any of the trees to see how many rings it has, but being a temperate area, in other places where you'd have trees like that, that tree may only be 25 years old, and therefore the collapse and the straightening has happened in a much earlier time. And the fact that other parts are still collapsing makes me think that it's been collapsing, and then every layer just comes on and slowly goes back, and it keeps eroding away at the side of the mountain.
Well, that's an interesting point that Fomenko brings up is, he doesn't say that dendrochronology is not worthwhile. He does. And a lot of people believe that who are not married to the ideas behind dendrochronology and how ring growth happens and in what time frame it happens. But just as you illustrated there, as far as the trees righting themselves, you would be able to tell more if you were able to cut that and look at ring growth. If you were looking at ring growth, I would say in a different way, as far as the way that Fomenko articulates what he believes ring growth indicates. I agree very much with what he has to say about dendrochronology in chronology 1, but I just want to point out, as you had stated there, that there's so much that you can tell about a site and its age just by observing basic tree growth patterns.
Yes, absolutely. And it's definitely, there's no doubt that in a tree goes through a season, you end up getting one ring. So it's a very good indication of how many years have passed since another event occurred. If you had a great fire, that ring on that place would be a little bit blackened. And you could, if you cut down the tree recently, you'd be able to tell how many years ago that event actually occurred. Same
So
thing
what do
with
you
the
think
actual
about the
bending.
ideas of drought and heavy rain as far as the ring growth goes?
Well, drought seasons, they're small rings. Monsoon seasons, they seem to be much wider,
Mm-hmm.
or wet seasons.
Do you agree with most of what Fomenko has to say about the uh, problems with dendrochronology?
I agree that a lot of those things are unexplained, and it's very difficult with other research that's come out to completely disregard the idea that maybe we've got the dendrochronology wrong in putting together multiple trees and assuming that the overlap with the dry seasons and the wet seasons being lined up can lead us to a time further in the past.
Well, yeah,
And
that was one of the assumptions, wasn't it? Is that
that's
if you had far more rings, you would just assume that the tree was extremely old, whereas it could have just experienced a lot of shifts in uh, wetter seasons, drier seasons. Uh, there just seems to be this assumption that leads to an aging problem with assuming that trees have a certain amount of age based on just the way that they're reading the rings. I mean, wasn't that one of the chief problems that Fomenko had with dendrochronology in general?
the problem that he had was that they were extending the dendrochronological reach back into a time further than any tree by itself could have lived. So they've found a 3,000-year-old tree that can take us back to a certain time. And then from the pharaoh's tomb, they found another 2,000-year-old cedar. And then by comparing the annual growth rings, as long as they lived at some time and overlapped, you can say short, short, long, long, short, 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 long, long, short is an actual pattern. And if you come across that, you can then say, okay, well, this other tree can extend our chronology back even further. And so a lot of the problem is, do those overlaps actually represent that same point in history, or is it possible you could get repeating cycles of weather that they would actually look like they line up, but it actually isn't that old?
Which appears that that's the case too. I mean, you can just look at any area over about a century and see that it's common for that to happen. Repeating cycles of weather.
Correct.
Yeah,
You see that all the time.
yeah, sure do. Okay, I don't want to hold you up if you want to keep moving forward. That was all I could think of so far on that was how you mentioned the tree growth.
Well, there's also, yeah, the tree growth that, and how that actually relates to the radiocarbon dating. And that's the one I think that could probably take us off on a huge tangent.
I agree.
So I might continue on.
Yeah.
All right, so the next we've got the polygonal masonry. And so this is one of the sites where we had to go to and actually collect a free ticket. They're counting the number of people who are actually visiting the sites. And this is what we decided appears just to be a Roman road, the foundation of it. It's very wide. It obviously would have had smaller stones placed on top so wagons could actually travel on it. Underneath this excavated area, you can actually see how much soil is sitting above it. And that's only about a foot of soil. Going down towards the gate, you can actually see the polygonal masonry on the actual walls. And those stones that they're using are actually very large. The cuts are very straight, and they are all polygonal. Piece of modern work that appears to have been placed in there. Looking up from the gate on the road, more of the polygonal blocks on each side. Looking from the top of the gate, along one of the retaining walls. All of the land up here is much higher than down below. You can actually see the comparison now between Simone, our Italian guide, and the size of these stones that were actually making up this wall. Looking up at the wall and more of the polygonal styles. A little what probably would have been a guard tower or the basis of it. And more of the wall heading off. And this is the front entrance to the actual site. This looks like to be a separate wall that was built at a different time. Notice the style doesn't appear to match at all of the rock behind. Another retaining wall, which was higher up. This is actually where the temples are. We'll see those pictures later. And again, these are massive stones that have been there for a long time. It's a rather thick tree trunk that's growing out of the wall there. They've got polygonal masonry on the dams that they used on their rivers. Even this, not sure how old this bench would be, but there was a lot of moss covering these stones that were running along here, and this appears to be a seat. Finally, a church wall with massive stone blocks at the foundation. The apse on the actual temple was pointing to the sunset, which means it's likely not originally a Christian church. The rock-cut graves in there and myself lying in one would have been a rather tight fit. And more, this is a second church that we went to, and more of the stones. And around here, I started realizing that they had these areas, that containers here with a hole in it and a smaller container below, and they all look like they're wine presses. And everywhere I looked then, you could just see wine presses or some sort of presses for whatever hazelnuts they have to get the oil out, olive oil. They did have a lot of olive trees there. Grapes obviously would be a common one. And again, all over the place, there were just these wine presses.
Well, so they were obviously civilized. They appreciated their wine and their oils. They look absolutely like the oldest wine and oil presses that I've seen. But what do you think that they've found polygonal structures everywhere? Let's just say everywhere. I mean, everywhere you can inhabit, essentially. From Scandinavia, the Mediterranean, East Orient, the Americas, everywhere. They have found polygonal walls, structures, streets, all of them seemingly inexplicable. Some of them with mortar, some without mortar. But in almost every case, using stones, and I saw the size of those, especially when I saw that photograph with your Italian guide. They're big stones. And then that's always raising the question of how these were moved around without large machinery. And in some cases, they couldn't even be moved around with modern machinery we have. What do you make of how ubiquitous polygonal masonry is the world over? I mean, do you have any theories on that?
Well, I have a couple of hypotheses. One of them would be that there was contact pre-Columbian around the world, and somebody shared the knowledge. The other one would be that it's a logical progression to make an earthquake-safe wall, because after the earthquake, the pieces seem to fall back into place, whereas with square blocks, nothing is forcing them back into place. So due to the engineering improvement, that could be one reason why polygonal blocks show up.
Earthquake proof.
The walls in Peru have lasted through quite a few earthquakes. You'll see a few of them that actually show where the earthquake was strong enough to actually cause a separation. The rest of them are still tightly locked together, and there are quite a few earthquakes that occur in that area.
That's smart. So you'll have you seen a pattern of far more polygonal walls and structures in areas more prone to earthquakes than in ones not very prone to earthquakes?
I just assumed every place ends up getting earthquakes eventually. And I don't know of any sites in areas that don't get earthquakes.
Hmm.
I haven't really seen any sites in places that I know don't get lots of earthquakes, but the islands all around north of Australia get earthquakes. Even Melbourne gets the occasional earthquake. I mean, very low, 2 on the Richter scale, nothing like California. But in California, polygonal masonry would be a very good idea.
Yeah, but they don't practice good ideas in California. So
You can always hope for them and pray for them.
you better, actually, because they need it. But yeah, you'll find that I could see that, finding that around the Ring of Fire, the Pacific Rim, and of course, there's a number of other serious fault lines in the world too. So yeah, I could understand. I really wasn't entirely aware that most areas of the world experience earthquake. I imagine some more often than others and some more intense than others. But yeah, obviously that's why you would see those structures like in South America, and there's still some left in Central America. Not as much left in North America, but I won't even go into the theories of why I believe that is. So it's really interesting. I've thought about polygonal structures like that, and to be honest with you, I hadn't heard or read um, anybody talking about how well they hold up against earthquakes. You're the first that I've heard, and I feel a little bit silly if this is relatively common knowledge, but I had never really put much thought into it on an engineering level, but it makes a lot of sense.
All right. And you earlier mentioned Sylvie's theories, and one of
Yeah.
them that she has are these cart ruts. And so
Yeah.
these are paths that go through pretty much everywhere. They're very common in Malta, and you'll see places that just have fields of them, and some of them are almost 3 feet deep. And apparently, it looks like carts were actually dragged over them. Whoa. So this is looking out off the road, and it looks like this is where the ancient road ran, and they had a modern road that just picked up and then built on top of where the ancient road actually would have been. Through a field, there's another place where these don't exactly look like normal cart ruts that you'd see in the other places, because they don't seem to be parallel to each other. These ones, you just see several of them next to each other, but they don't appear to go on very long. Nothing like what you'd see in Malta. This field looks like it's had erosion that's come in there from a modern vehicle. And as we look deeper, it does definitely look like it was a piece of construction equipment that was driven across these rocks, showing how soft these rocks actually are. When metal tracks are then drug across them, they do fall apart pretty easily. Again, more looking through this field that had these interesting paths all around. Some of them were actually had some steps in it, and different terrace levels were going down. They seemed to be everywhere. And finally, more steps on the path that were leading down. These did appear to be cut by man. And finally, we get to the actual quarry where you see these all the time. Now, when we first saw all of these tracks here, I thought it was a front end loader that was basically just scooping down and dragging its claw across. But it is actually solid rock that's there. And it looked very interesting and rather old. Don't know why it would actually, what could actually cut so many parallel grooves into the quarry. And looking at the quarry, you can see where they would find the good rock actually ended and just stopped digging. Along a different path, you can see there was the good rock, and then this brown or black rock wasn't very good for construction. It doesn't handle compression very well, whereas the white ash material was light and could actually withstand the compression. And I might just jump ahead into the quarries and the mines because this one's really short.
Absolutely.
It's actually another quarry that we looked at, and this entire section of the mountain had been removed and quarried. This is a closer look up of all of this white stone that they seem to use for building high up. A little channel where they've actually now carved an entire irrigation channel that runs all the way to the large lake in the middle of Italy. And this was one of the paths that was behind it, which actually led to an entire cavern. This door here looked rather unassuming. Going through there, it was quite a long ways before it actually opened up into a huge ravine. And there was also plenty of other stuff there. Now this is the ash mine, which is one that we thought might actually be an ancient cave, but it has lots of signs of modern use and removing this material. It was very large and very cut out, and they seemed to be just a small structure left and a small hill on top of the harder material so they could just get at the material without strip mining. And in the back, you could see this tailings pile to show that it was actually, they were getting rid of this rock that they didn't want in order to get the ash. Everything inside that cave was very brittle. You could basically use your hand to scrape away the wall. So they would use this most likely in creating concrete.
Okay, so do you want to wait on that next section then?
I can wait on the next section.
Okay. The reason is I don't want to, I'm going to try to hold back questions that can rabbit trail you because I'm the king of rabbit trails. My own brain does it to me where I'll start a thought and it'll rabbit trail me just, 180 degrees away from that thought. But those ruts, I've seen those a lot commented on in Sylvie's videos. Ruts that seem to be cut in a lot of different kinds of rock in different places. Is there any uniform nature to these or many of them, as far as, for instance, railroad tracks? They have to be made to a certain specific uniform standard. In one country anyways, where trains are going to be traveling, in order for all types of trains to be able to travel upon them. Is there any kind of uniform features to many of these ruts that you see in roads and whatnot?
In Malta, we actually measured the distance between the individual ruts, seeing how it changed over the duration of the course. And a lot of them did seem to be fairly common, but occasionally you would get a variation of about 6 inches. And that would mean either the wheels weren't tight on the axle or they weren't on an axle. And it would just be a single path is what you're using, maybe like a wheelbarrow to actually carry the rock.
Mm. It's pretty strange though, because well, I guess you would just start to think about what all the uses of such ruts in stone would be, how you would manage to get them in there. I mean, I guess usage over a period of time, but it seems like, especially in some of the harder rock, that we're talking about a heck of a lot of um, heavy usage of, what it's, I guess it's hard to say, that would cut such grooves, because I've seen a number of her photographs that seem to show some pretty deep grooves that seem like they would either take a long time to cut, or you would have to really intentionally be trying to cut these into that rock for a very specific purpose. Are most of them doubled grooves? I mean, except for like instances that you illustrated at the quarry, aren't most of them uh, uh, in twos that are found?
Most of them do appear to come in twos and would look like they were coming from a long use of time just digging into the rock. Now, what was actually impacting on the rock, you don't know. The interesting thing about Sylvie's tours is she can actually take you to places where it looks like the solid stone was splashing, as if the entire surface of the rock was made soft and a cart went over it, causing a mud splash to come up, and then that was frozen back into just being solid stone. A theory I came up with while we were there is, well, if something did go across and then a glacier came down, that may provide enough force that would actually turn that dirt into rock. If it was dirt at one time, a cart went across, left those trails, and then some cataclysm came and the snow just built up and you had 100 years of ice age with a glacier on top of Italy, that might do it. According to the current geological surveys, there hasn't been a glacier on Italy for quite a long, long time. Well, long,
Yeah.
probably before humans.
Yeah, most of the ice age theories I've ever heard only bring glaciers down just part way into, like, northern Europe, France. They don't seem to get to Italy in those, the various ice age theories, because not everybody has the same ice age theory either. And I guess there's a lot of theories out there concerning the rock anomalies they found, because what you mentioned about splashing, like as if the rock were liquid. There's a lot of anomalies that I've seen or heard of in rock, and I guess there's a lot of theories, because I mean, how many ways can rock be liquid? It can be another material at one time and then become rock, like igneous, and that's what you're talking about with pressure from a glacier. But then the only other ways are either heat, which you wouldn't expect much to be going through extremely hot rock, not rock that could splash. It would have to be extremely hot. Or there's others who theorize that perhaps some ancient cultures with techniques that we don't know of or have today had other means with which they could soften rock. Or then there's also the various concrete theories that there were cultures that could essentially make a concrete out of basically any kind of rock that exists. So who
I think
knows?
both of those theories may be possibilities because I've seen the effects, and so far they're closer than any other normal explanation can get me.
Yeah, concerning the anomalies that you see
Concerning the
in rock.
anomalies. Other ones, it's obvious it looks like a trail. And
Yeah.
over long uses of time, carrying very heavy stones would actually cause some of those indentations. Because
Mhm.
especially it's in those quarries where you get down to the bad rock, the rock that's brittle. And so that dark gray rock that you see is actually a clay stone that's been compressed, and it just breaks really easily. So when you're carrying something really heavy over on it, you'd end up cracking that rock as you're going through it.
Mhm.
Other
You know,
things that we've seen on the top of the mountains that look like It was a track that went through before the rock hardened.
You know, this may sound, I'm sure it is kind of ignorant, not being a geologist, but it's interesting that like in a quarry, you would find what you're talking about, more of a clay um, under the rock, when I guess somebody like me who's not a geologist would just expect that, you know, the rock would be harder, I guess, as you go, which, you know, that being the case, then I guess you would expect um, topological forces to be creating that, and for it to mostly be igneous. Is that most of the rocks that you're seeing in quarries like that is igneous rock as opposed to like metamorphic or anything?
Okay, well, you basically have your sandstone, which is be underneath the oceans and packed really tight, and that turns into layers.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have limestone, which is caused from all of the sea life shells going down and crushing, and then that becoming a layer.
Yep.
And so when those get then pulled above, when plates move and those surfaces rise above, you can end up having those, and you can then quarry that sandstone.
Mm-hmm.
Igneous rock would be something that formed as melted. So you'd have melted lava that came up, and that would form technically your pumice, which is the very light stuff that's blown out of the volcano, your paui paui, which is the Hawaiian, just really sharp rock that you basically your lava flows that's happening. If it happens at a deep level, then you're going to get your other igneous rocks like your granites and your marbles. So
I
those would be
apologize.
pressed together under great temperature and then they become very hard.
Yeah, I'm
Metamorphic
sorry.
rock
I switched the
compressed.
yeah, I switched the definitions. I'm sorry, of metamorphic and igneous. I apologize. Yeah, so that's what I meant to call it all metamorphic rock as opposed to igneous. Okay. So nothing that you would find, you would think is out of place at all in a quarry, digging down until now you have clay. That's not an oddity. That's something that you would actually see quite a bit happening when you dig into quarries.
Areas that are high with sandstone, because you'll have different layers that are built up over time.
Mm-hmm.
And as the continents move above water and below water, or the sea level changes, whichever one, you'll end up with different deposits going into that rock. And
Mm-hmm.
you'll have bad mud that maybe comes from the erosion of a volcano. And so that makes very coarse, brittle mud that would then collapse together. And that would be sort of that gray clay stuff that's brittle underneath. And as that goes under the water, you then have millions of years of seashells falling in there and then collapsing. More stuff goes on, it turns that into stone. And when that rises above the water again, you'll have what you can quarry. And so as soon as you see good stone is it exposed, you can then start your quarry and you cut down until you get to the bad stuff. And once you get to the bad stuff, there's a couple holes that you'll see drilled or dug out, and that would be to check to see if there's better rock below, because it may just be a thin layer of the bad stuff and then you'll get to better stuff. I looked at the geology of Malta quite a bit, which shows this a lot better than with Italy. It's really just the tufa where we were at. There's no other layers. You've got some of the old mountains that would come through, which does have some of the harder rock, but everything else that people would generally use and carve into is that tufa, and you can't really tell the difference between many of the layers.
Mm-hmm. A interesting bit of trivia. There is, well, I know it's about the largest amount in the country. I don't know how it rates worldwide, but more sandstone comes from central Indiana. Limestone comes from central Indiana, not sandstone, limestone. Then I want to say on a worldwide scale, it's pretty high up there. But in the United States, yeah, it's the top. I'm pretty sure the top limestone producers, limestone quarries in central Indiana, which is interesting because with it being metamorphic rock, then what you would expect is for a sea to have been atop that at least for some time. And again, coal deposits in Indiana and Illinois, pretty darn gigantic, which of course Coal is also an element that is supposed to need a certain amount of compression for formation. And that's not an odd thing to find in the Midwest of the United States. So these theories about a sea actually being over the Midwest region of the United States seems to be more and more plausible based on the things that you would find.
Definitely, especially if you include the salt mines in Kansas. There's a 10-foot layer of salt that seems to run under quite a bit of Kansas.
Yes,
So
I've heard about the Kansas one. Yeah.
that could just be the ocean. Then something happened. The Rockies came up 60 million years ago, sometime between 70 and 60 million years ago, cutting off the flow, creating a land thing, and then eventually it would dry away and evaporate,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
leaving behind the Mississippi Basin.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of geological theories about that, but definitely a lot of evidence that would suggest that the middle part of the United States was underwater at some point in time or another.
Well, what's really interesting is looking at the radiocarbon dating. So Libby, back in 1966, released his fourth version of items that they'd actually radiocarbon dated. And he found shells at a depth of 12 inches on a place that was 100 feet above sea level that dated to 2400 BC.
By radiocarbon standards?
By radiocarbon dating, the shell stopped growing 2,500 years ago. So at that
2,500
point,
years ago or BC?
BC, sorry,
Okay. Okay.
2000. No, actually, yeah, 2000. No, 2,500 years ago.
Oh, okay.
I'll have
So
to look
that
that up.
really
I thought it was
throws.
BC, but it was what I was just saying. I'm pretty sure it's BC, actually. Sorry.
No, it's
So
okay.
2,500 BC, that area land was actually underneath water, and it's currently 100 feet above water. The area is growing pretty fast coming out of the ocean at 3 inches per year.
Wait,
But I've
one more
looked
time.
at
This
the
is
math and it doesn't add up to 100 feet.
one more time. What area is that? Now I paid attention to who released the findings, but remind me what area?
California,
That is in California.
which, if you think back to some of the ancient maps that had California as an island,
Yeah.
well, 2,500 years ago, the water levels were a lot higher.
Yeah. See, I had actually thought about that, those maps that show California, much of it as an island. And I had kind of wondered if maybe the reason that was is because, see, California has this huge north to south floodplain that at certain times it will flood, and it's serious flooding. The flooding can be 30 to 50 miles wide, hundreds of miles long north to south. And I had wondered if that's the reason that maybe, certain cartographers would have made it an island, or at least, you do see older maps that have the Gulf of California extended far, far up north, whether they have it as an island or not. But that's something. That's the first time I've heard of that. That they, to this day, they're still recording a rising of it out of the sea per year.
Yes,
Wow.
I basically just had to look around, and it's new research that came out, I believe, 2016, that says the San Diego area is raising by 3 inches a year.
And they can attribute that to volcanic subduction that's happening in the Pacific that's just pushing it. Is
I
that
believe that's what they're attributing it to.
okay?
They just measured it. So by satellites, they were able to measure the altitude change.
Okay. Oh, it's interesting. Yeah. Well, if you have more, don't let me stop you, because like I said, I will get you rabbit trailed before you know it.
All right, I'll continue on.
Okay.
So the next, one of the biggest features they have in there are these via cavas. And so these are basically paths that have been cut by man into the tofu rock that goes all the way from a flat plane at the top, which looks pretty much like this, and it's cut down at a gentle slope to get down to the river. Some of them, they've cut stairs into it, but this whole area was cut away. This one actually says private road, Ducreum Domites, so Master Ducrum. Seeing the stairs in another one of them, they've actually put a railing up there. They've added a little irrigation channel or improved it because that looks pretty good. So the water, you can still walk down where the water runs somewhere else. Again, this is cut rock. This used to be connected, and they've cut holes all the way down to the river. Again, this is looking from the top of one of them. All of this rock appears to be cut. Here's a little fort at the top, and there's some Christian crosses cut into it sometime, probably in the 1600s. Another Via Cava that's, again, cut through the rock. More of it where you can actually see the stairs have been cut into it, the drainage, old drainage channel, the new drainage channel going all the way. This one is a much wider one. You've got actually curved areas that look like this might have been an arch holding a bridge that would take you across where that fort was. Again, just cut straight through the rock. This is probably every site we went to, we pretty much needed to take at least one Via Cava. So we walked all the way down to the river and then walked back up the Via Cava all the way back to the car. Sometimes across the river to another one. And so this here is a sign of Leo on the side of the wall. Again, another Via Cava that was cut out. There's another, the actual cliff face would be here. And this allowed them just, I guess, shelter protection as they were walking. Probably taking their animals from the grazing fields down to the actual rivers. Again, rock cut runes cut into the side of the Via Cavas. All of this, the ground level is up here, and all of these have been cut by man. And finally, an interesting root that was actually the root of a tree. Looks like a wolf.
Yeah, that actually did look like a wolf.
It was actually pretty interesting. Might go on with the building runes, so we don't keep you too long.
Yeah.
So one thing, there are megalithic runes there. These stones are absolutely massive. And you can see the newer construction using smaller rocks built on the inside of that frame. Another large temple that was at the top of the hill. This is a path leading down to what they claimed was a church, with a nice rickety bridge going over it. Here's the backside of the church. And these apparently were doors at one time. And so there's a lot of erosion that's come through and made the level of the ground a lot higher. This is actually at Serrano. So there's a tourist village behind me, and this is the back side of it. These are rock cut ruins that go down in there. This is probably medieval castle style. These are some ancient temple ruins that are supposedly Etruscan. This is the Christian church that was built upon the Etruscan ruins. This is a very large cistern. I couldn't tell whether that was modern or older, but this wall here appears to be much older than these walls. This is something they'd recently excavated, which they said was a temple complex. This was a massive underground cistern that just went back and back and had some excellent acoustics in there. You can sing in there and you just get some great reverb. Here's another rock cut ruins that are pretty much a tourist area. There was a bus that we were keeping ahead of in order to get the pictures. Again, looking out from some of where the next place we went to was a sacred holy site. And it's just a beautiful, picturesque Tuscany area to get there. Here's the actual, this is a waterfall, which is at the center of the sacred site. And up here, you actually had a chapel. Inside the chapel, you had some beautifully carved, a rock-cut chapel there. And again, the acoustics inside this room would be great for their chanting. Looking out from that area is that. And I think that's, I've got like one more after this.
Okay. I actually recorded in a guy's house. He had a big recording studio. This was in the 90s when you all you had was either you had to go to a recording studio or you could invest the kind of money in a just maybe a 4 or 8 track tape machine or reel to reel. And he had one of the rooms he would record in was a bathroom at the back of his house, and he had this steel shower that he would actually record a lot of guitar tracks in because it made such interesting reverberations that you never had to use reverb. So I think it's interesting to pay attention to those natural acoustics that people, I think they really had a better sense of how to create acoustics in different environments with different materials than today. It just doesn't seem like you see as much natural building and structures and engineering that take advantage of natural acoustics based on materials and space as you saw then. I just, I'm one of those people who believes that we have regressed as opposed to progressed, I guess, in some ways. But a lot of that is based on the assumption that older civilizations didn't have the kind of technology that we do today. And I just think that's all an assumption as well.
Well, I don't think they had PVs or Marshall stacks, but they
Yeah.
could. They understood acoustics and they knew how to amplify the sounds. And that's one of the things from where we were inside that room when we were singing, we were kind of doing just some ancient songs. So you're just more 16th century gospel songs. You could actually, they said they heard it all throughout that bottom area. And there was a sign at the bottom that says, "Please be quiet."
Yeah.
You're not
And
supposed
that's what
to
you
be
would,
yelling or making that. So when you're up there and actually making those sounds, you can hear it through that entire sort of natural amphitheater.
yeah. And it amazes me that today there are a lot of performances, not big ones, smaller performances that go on in square or rectangular space, which just boggles my mind because of how bad the sound is in square and rectangular spaces. I used to be a performing musician. We performed in many different types of spaces, both interior and exterior. And I'm telling you again and again, the worst kind of space you can perform in is something that's square or rectangular. And you don't seem to see any of these spaces ever being square or rectangular. The ones with the best acoustics always seem to have shapes that are very conscientious to the way that sound waves travel. And they seem to make great use of it too. I mean, they can make sound waves travel in just these brilliant ways, to like where you said, certain areas that maybe you wouldn't think those sound waves are traveling, all throughout these spaces.
We saw quite a few actual examples of that on this trip. Inside the next section, when there's actually the official tourist park, they had another one of those, and we did the same thing from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will let you move forward. I won't hold you up.
All right, I'll go on with that one. So in the tourist park, this is actually one of the paid things, and there is just some amazing carvings in here. I'm not sure how old they are, but they do claim that these are from Etruscan area, so about 1000 BC. Obviously, they've done a little bit of work on it to restore it. This was actually a massive statue. That's basically waist level here for that railing. And it actually shows some pretty good detail in that. Picture of a Pegasus at a fountain, an absolutely giant turtle, a just courtyard area with some very impressive murals and some seats. a chimera in the background and a fountain. Other side of the fountain and a fish jumping out, or a fish head or a lizard. A very large statue. A vase. And it's this room here that when you go inside of it, broadcasts out to that entire area behind. So it faces the back of this elephant, and this is on the other side. And through that area, you can just hear everything that if you're inside that, just speaking at a normal voice. And finally, I saw this very interesting, what looks to be an ancient room. Then we can actually check the date, 2011. Here is another Etruscan park that had some of the most amazing rock cut features. Part of those are these actual columns. And so there was 4 different columns there at one time. 2 of them are really broken. Inside here, you can actually see the plaster that they would have applied to it in order to make it shining and white. There are plenty of broken statues that are lying around that they've excavated. The interesting lady with wings and a serpent's tail. A little chapel. Again, you can see where the plaster that would have been applied on there that they would have been writing with or writing on. And another temple on the other side of the complex. Of course, all of these do have rock cut ruins underneath as far as the tombs go, but you hardly see any of them. These were the only ones that were really present in this park, other than a couple other rooms and otherwhere, but nothing like you saw outside of these parks where they're just all over the place. And so above you can see some of the other rock cut features that they had. And I might just go on with the pyramid. There's only a few pictures on this one to finish it off. This was discovered in 2017. It was all overgrown before that. This basically is a little bit more stronger rock than the pumice that makes up all the other rocks, the tufa. And so these stones, or these stairs, were cut in there, go straight up there. Looking from the top, there's the stone path that goes down. And it looks to be a place where people would watch a play, maybe an auditorium. You can see where the stones go up there, and it's just a platform on top. This is a rather open area. Not sure if you'd have other royalty or there sitting there. And down below, they had this other place where this was cut out, and we had no idea what that would have been for. It was just a much smaller rock. That's probably 6 feet just right there. But it does appear that all of this was cut out at some time from the larger rock, maybe to provide blocks for something else. And so again, there's a group of us on the top of that pyramid. And so the main takeaways that I got from it is almost all of the areas around where we were had rock cut ruins. The rock is very soft to cut into, and a lot of it has been excavated. You'll see more ruins outside of the paid tourist parks. And some places are free, but do require you to obtain a ticket. According to Sylvie, erosion has claimed about 1 meter of cliff face containing ruins in some areas in the past 3 years. She will actually be doing a video on that soon, which when she covers all of those things, she was going to show what it looked like 3 years ago and the current pictures from this last expedition. The tilted tree growth does show where many recent collapses have occurred, and the bent trunks do show where the earlier collapses was. And the one final thing to note is in Italy, pizza is only available after about 8:30 p.m. You can't get it for lunch. The rest of the food is great, and the house wine is at any place is just about as good as the expensive bottles.
Well, that's crap, because I ate pizza for breakfast.
Not in Italy, you won't be, unless you take it from the night before.
Oh, well, that's okay. I'll keep that in mind, though. 8:30. I'm in bed by then.
The first day we were there, we went out about 7 to get dinner. And yeah, nothing was open until 8:30. They did let us come in and order at 7:45. The cook turned everything on early so we could eat.
That seems to be a very
Three
Mediterranean thing.
bottles of €30 wine before we got to that point.
Mm. That does seem to be a really Mediterranean thing, though. Very late dinners, not just Italy, all around the Mediterranean.
It's probably too hot in the day still at 5, 6 o'clock.
Yeah, who wants to eat dinner then? When it's sweaty and ugh, I don't even like. I don't want to. Where we live, the way that we get our exposure, from the sun, we have a house. These walls are block. And so it wasn't well insulated. And oftentimes in the summer, we do not want to run that oven. And we wouldn't even think about it until after that sun went down and these block walls, especially along the wall that the kitchen is on, an outside wall, until it cooled down. And it takes it hours to start to cool down. So, I mean, that just makes a lot of sense in a climate like the Mediterranean. Um, that for one thing, you really wouldn't want ovens going until it started cooling down a bit, because it would be so hot and uncomfortable.
Without air conditioning, it could be terrible.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would think so. Um, well, let's see. I know we're already past an hour and an hour and a half, but time flies, when you're having a good time. Um, I think a lot of the extra things that I had thought about were mostly just, well, in case we run low on material, we could talk about those things. But any of those things, if I bring them up, we would be sitting here at least another hour or so. And I don't know about you, but I can't do that. Um, I did really enjoy uh, looking at this. Um, I know you went through there some of the takeaways. I know you probably don't want to talk too extensively about certain aspects of it, or Sylvie's theories, because I'm sure since she's working on a video concerning all of that right now, you wouldn't want any spoilers or to speak for her. One of the things that I would say that this illustrates concerning either tree growth, rate of erosion, and the rate of erosion that you just said that Sylvie said had taken place in what, 10 years is just insane. It's so much.
In 3 years.
I'm sorry, 3 years.
So
My
about
my
1
mistake.
per
That's a
year.
lot. That's a lot. Somebody in the comments actually even mentioned when you stated the amount of growth that they say that they have um, demonstrated in California. I mean, it would mean 400 feet in 100 years, or 100 feet in 400, and that's still a lot. Actually, it's 100 feet in 400 years.
Yeah, 100 and 400. Yeah,
Yeah,
100 feet and 400 years. Yeah, I guess that would work.
and that's pretty big, and of course, part of that would be based on the assumption that everything has been working in the same steady manner for so long. And that's one of the problems that you have too with carbon dating, is certain assumptions that certain phenomena has been occurring at the same rate for an extended period of time.
Well,
And
I'd have to say that the decay rate is pretty certain that that does happen at a certain rate.
yeah,
The question comes into is what was the initial concentration?
correct.
What truly is the half-life of carbon-14? The
Hmm.
current accepted value is 5,730 years.
Yeah.
I have seen papers recommending from respectable scientists that it could be 3,700 years.
Hmm. Well, yeah, with carbon 14, you should have a steady decay rate. But again, the big question is, what were the concentrations at certain times, and how much carbon 14 was being created? Is that steady or not? Which, again, they have no way of measuring that. And even that's an assumption.
Again,
Um,
those papers that Libby actually put out do measure that on a yearly basis from 1965 for about 10 years.
mhm.
And quite often you'll see that the active carbon level is 63% above to 93% above what the measured standard was in 1950 version that they had, 58. But they counted backwards from 1950. They say it's because of all the nuclear testing that occurred. That is why there's 60 to 90% more active carbon. And the active carbon has been hypothesized to come down when you have strong winds from Alaska to the actual station in California where they were measuring it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the production of carbon 14, it's still based on some assumptions. I mean, yeah, they have recorded it in certain places, but like you said, that they're still stuck with possible variations and therefore assumptions based on things like variations and whatnot. It goes to show that this is one of the things that's just so upsetting about, first off, about chronology, and secondly about certain disciplines and sciences, is that we can observe phenomena, but there can be multiple reasons why we observe that, and to just decree that the only reason it could be is this one singular reason. It at the best seems short-sighted, and at the worst conspiratorial. And I know that this is where a number of researchers, depending on what field we're talking about, would greatly disagree with me, or I disagree with them, because so often in life and with sciences and disciplines, there's usually many different reasons why something can appear as whatever it is, and we're talking about a huge range of areas, some disciplines being more exacting than others. But Chip, do you have any closing thoughts on any of this that you'd like to say before we wrap? I never knew that I didn't even notice that we had gone as long as we did until I looked at the clock, because that was such a good presentation. I was really interested. The wheels were turning the whole time. I wish I would have thought of better questions, though. Anything that you thought of during this that you'd like to leave us with?
Well, just that the ancient history that as we know it can be interpreted in many different ways, and actually tying down those exact dates is almost impossible, even for using the most scientific methods. Now, I do believe radiocarbon dating does give us a good measure if something is a lot older than something else, based upon, the values show that it's very low on active carbon. It's a lot older than this. Those are great for actually ordering those chronological values. When they do get within 20% of each other, then you can actually have those overlap periods, and it's possible that you get the orders wrong. And so a lot of the things that we see with these Etruscan ruins make it look like they could possibly be much younger than what the mainstream historians say.
Yeah, and like we talked about the other day, it's I know it's not often freely admitted, but it is admitted by various scientists that they are just simply using the agreed upon Scaliger chronology to gauge the dates, the time spans that they're oftentimes putting on things, whether that be carbon 14 or dendrochronology, whether that be archaeology. Most disciplines in mainstream academia today, admittedly, are just using Scalagerian chronology as their basis of assumption of how old anything is. Isn't that correct?
And that's what I've seen so far in the papers that I have found that actually cover the half-life of carbon-14. It appears they're using all Scalagerian dates, whether it be when Pompeii was buried as Mount Vesuvius erupted, how long ago was the sack created that held a piece of the Dead Sea Scrolls, wood from the tomb of a pharaoh with a known date, range of dates for his reign, and so on and so forth. Those appear to be the artifacts that have been used. Nobody's actually done a specific measurement where they've taken a sample, measured it, waited 50 years, and then measured it again to see if you get that 5% drop.
Yeah, for anybody who's interested, it doesn't take a lot of digging to find that. That's been one of the problems, is most people believe that in a lot of various disciplines, that they are simply based on some sort of a worked out science that they have apart from Scalagerian chronology. And you'll find with just a little bit of effort that that is typically not the case, and that for hundreds of years, especially the last 1 to 2 centuries, Scaliger Patavius has been the absolute undisputed chronological map that pretty much every discipline uses. And when academicians veer from that, they are heavily criticized simply just for not staying to that chronology, and oftentimes ostracized if they won't get back into place with that Scalagerian chronology. A lot of interesting stuff, and hopefully I can have you on again before too long, and we can talk more about those things. Unfortunately, I've had this message up the whole time since we started. A message up telling me that Hangouts on Air is going away August 1st. Now, hopefully that doesn't mean that we won't have a way of doing this live, but if that turns out to be the case, we really didn't have many questions this time, so I don't know that it's really going to throw us at all if we have to just pre-record and present this stuff.
All right. Well, thanks, John, for having me on.
No, thank you for coming. It's been really enjoyable, and I'm sure we'll do this again sometime soon. And hey, every time you come, it's really a good talk, and everybody learns something. And we usually, I know I do, have to replay it 2 or 3 times to make sure that I'm absorbing all of the information, because that's the kind of in-depth stuff you usually bring. So thank you again, Chip, and we'll see you again, I'm sure, very soon.
All right. Thanks again, John. See you
All
soon.
right. Have a good night.
Bye.
Everybody, I want to remind you that the last Sunday of this month, I'm going to be having on JD from UB Freedom. He is scheduled to be on the last Sunday of this month. JD is in North America, so this one should go on at noon Eastern, which is the normal default time. But of course, we have to adjust because a number of people are from different parts of the world. That one's going to be really interesting. JD focuses on really trying to equip basically everybody who is involved with the Western legal system, which is pretty much ubiquitous around the world now, because the same people with their same fingerprints are all over all modern societies. So we're going to find that there's many similarities to law, no matter what country you're in. There may be specifics. There are differences between Canadian law and law in the United States. It's true, but there are many similarities. And one thing that JD concentrates on, or has a specialty in, is defending yourself in the sense of private person as compared to public person. And so I'm looking forward to that. I'm thinking it's going to be a really good time. Hopefully everybody will join us for that. And thank you for stopping in, everybody who did. So we'll see you at the end of this month, because we had to put this off by a week because of some issues I had. So at the end of this month, we should be doing that broadcast with JD, and I will see everyone then. Take care.